In this video, we'll be looking at independence. For events to be independent, they need to be unrelated to one another. So, for example, if I take a die and roll it on a table, and pick it up and roll it again, what I get on the second roll has nothing to do with what I get on the first roll. Those are independent events. However, if I take a deck of cards and draw a card off and set it aside, and then draw a second card, what I get for the second card is dependent on what that first card was. So in this video, we'll be looking at how to test for independence. So for our first example, we have a made-up survey of people living in St. Louis and people living in Kansas City, and whether or not they're Cardinals fans or Royals fans. So what we want to test is being a Cardinals fan independent of living in St. Louis? Or in other words, is a person living in St. Louis just as likely to be a Cardinals fan as a Royals fan as the people living in Kansas City? So to do this, what we're going to do is multiply the probability of being a Cardinals fan times the probability of living in St. Louis and see if that equals the probability of being a Cardinals fan and living in St. Louis. And so this is the definition of whether events are independent. If two events are independent, we can multiply them together to get the intersection. If they're not independent, we can't do this. So the probability of being a Cardinals fan, if we look here, there are 81 Cardinals fans in this survey out of the 150 people. So that's 81 out of 150. Probability of living in St. Louis, so that's 82 people total that live in St. Louis out of the 150 total. And then the probability of being a Cardinals fan and living in St. Louis. So Cardinals fan and living in St. Louis, that's the 77 people right here. Again, out of the 150. And so if we do this calculation, 81 over 150 times 82 over 150, we get approximately 0.2952. And then if we divide 77 by 150, we get approximately 0.5133. And we can see that these are certainly not independent, which makes sense. People who live in St. Louis are probably more likely to be Cardinals fans. People who live in Kansas City, more likely to be Royals fans. Let's look at another example. So in this, another made-up survey, we have people from Fayetteville and people from Fort Smith, and whether or not they are Razorbacks fans or not. So the question we want to answer is being a Razorbacks fan independent of living in Fayetteville, assuming that we're only looking at places within the state of Arkansas. So in other words, are people in Fort Smith just as likely to be Razorbacks fans as the people in Fayetteville? So to do that, we'll again use the formula. We'll multiply the two events together, being a Razorback fan and living in Fayetteville, and see if that equals the intersection of being a Razorbacks fan and living in Fayetteville. So multiply the probability of being a Razorbacks fan times the probability of living in Fayetteville. And we want to see, is that equal to the probability of being a Razorbacks fan and living in Fayetteville. All right, so the probability of being a Razorbacks fan, if we look at the Razorbacks fans overall, that's 135 out of the 144. Probability of living in Fayetteville, that's 80 people total out of the 144. The probability of being a Razorbacks fan and living in Fayetteville, that's 75 people out of 144. And so if we do these calculations, 135 over 144 times 80 over 144, we get approximately 0.5208, and then some more decimals. And 75 divided by 144, we get 0.5208, and those same decimals after that. So we can see that these are indeed equal, which means they're independent. And what that would tell us is that whether you live in Fayetteville or you live in Fort Smith, you're equally likely to be a Razorback fan. So the overall formula, again, for testing for independence is if the probability of event A times the probability of event B equals the probability of the intersection of A and B, then the events are independent.